Hello, and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of History and the 25th Annual American Indian Heritage Celebration. Our presenter, Jamie Locklear, will begin in just a moment, but we would like to start with a few notes. Remember to ask questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond to them and share with our presenter. We have many additional resources about American Indians in North Carolina on our website, nc-aihc.com. We'd like to thank the following sponsors of the North Carolina Museum of History Foundation for helping to make this event possible. Now let's get started. Welcome, Jamie. What are you sharing with us today?
Today I will be doing a presentation on pine needle basket making, or how to get started on it, on how to weave the pine needle baskets. Me personally, I like to think outside the box. I just don't do baskets. I do the concept of baskets and everything, but I do a lot of stuff outside of the box of basket making. Because a lot of the Native American communities today are dancers, like to show off their ancestry work, where they used to do pine needles, and they wear it on their regalias and stuff. And you'll see a lot of the dancers in the arena today. And if we had dancers here today, you would see a lot of those actually wearing pine needle basket or the pine needle work on their regalias. I have 4 boys who have danced, and they've always had some kind of pine needle work on their regalias throughout their years of dancing and everything. And I've made disc, and a lot of the dancers like to have the disc where they're easy to put on the baskets and stuff like this. This would be a scarf that they would wear. And this is something that my boys have wore throughout their reign. I took the pine needle baskets, and I did go traveling throughout Indian country, where I saw other tribes who made baskets and stuff. They would take their basket work and make crowns for their princesses. And I'd come up with the same concept with using pine needles to make crowns. And I have a few dancers who actually wear them. And they got the same concept as pine needle baskets, and it's in the crown as well. But today we will be focusing more on pine needles, making the basket, instead of doing other things. A lot of people ask, where do I get pine needles from and everything? A lot of times you'll go and you will see regular pine needle trees or pine trees, and you'll just see regular pine needles like 4 or 5 inches. And this is you can use those pine needles, but they're harder to work with because they're so short, and you have to add more to them and stuff. And if you do find longleaf pine, one of the things, if you're looking for, you need to look for, if you find the big pine cones there, you'll find longleaf pine. Have story behind pine cones and stuff too, growing up. And that was especially this time of the year, we always decorate them for as turkeys, and always had our handprint on them, drawn in them, and it was turkeys. I love to tell that to the kids when they come around. But they're amazed at how big the pine cones are when you do find the pine. But I have found longleaf pine that is 26 inches long. A lot of people don't believe me, but I have found it, and this here is actually pushing 20 inches, this one here. But it's according to where you find it at. And it used to grew all throughout the state of North Carolina, from the north to south, east and west. But through cutting trees down and taking the seedlings and stuff and growing, we don't have a lot of the longleaf pine up north. It's more found in the southern part of the state. But but we're going to get started on the basket in just a second. I'm going to go over a couple of stitches, and this is just the concept of finding the stitches. And when you go right into each other, you're going to make a pattern, and it'll look better on the basket and stuff. Or you can do it where it interlocks, to me it looks more like bricks when you're doing a pattern where you go in between the stitches. But we'll get started now. First of all, on the pine needles, you want to take the ends off of the pine needle. You can make baskets with those on it, but they're harder. To me, you're taking away from the basket because you're seeing the tips of it and it's sticking out. That's something for more advanced basket makers. But first of all, we're going to take the tips and just pinch. All I'm doing is pinching it and just pulling. Just pinch and pull. Pinch and pull. That's all you got to do. And that's that easy to pull them off. Some people talk about how do you collect the pine needles. You can, if you got access to it, you can go up under the tree and just pick up the pine needles off the ground. And preferably you'd pick up the ones that land on top because they are not rotten, they're not decaying and everything. So you just pick up the ones on top. But me personally, I have access to so many trees. I'll find the trees where they're still green, and I'll crop the leaves off, the pine needles off. Like I tell people, like I used to crop tobacco, is the way I crop the pine needles off. And I collect them green, then they're clean, they're not dirty and stuff, and they've never touched the ground, so they're not dirty. You don't have to. A lot of people like to wash theirs. Me, preferably, I don't wash my pine needles because I think that's taken away from the natural of the pine needle. You're taking away the sin of the pine needle and the pine tree off of the pine needle. So I do not wash mine. Only time when I first start a basket, I wet the tip of the pine needle, which is the end with the barb on it, or the piece that was in the pine cone. I wet this end here, and when I wet this in, I can bend it without breaking. That's the only time I wet my pine needles, because I collect mine, like I said, I collect them off the tree. They're clean, so they're not dirty, and I like to keep the sin of them natural. So I don't wet mine no more than that, because some people boil theirs and they soak them overnight. To me, you're taking away you're breaking down the pine needle when you soak it a lot and you boil it. You're breaking it down where it can break easier. So basically, I have some pine needles here, and all I've done is took them in a water bottle, and they've been soaking usually 20 to 30 minutes. I let them soak where I can work with them. So I have my pine needles soaking right here, and traditionally, my ancestors, which a lot of times my grandparents, their brothers and sisters and stuff like that, they would have took tobacco twine, and they would have used that because we were farming communities. They would have had tobacco twine available, especially if we just come out of tobacco season this time of the year. Pine needles are actually this time of the year are the best to gather because they're the thickest, and they're falling. They're started falling. So this is a good time of the year to start collecting them for the whole year to use. So my grandparents and stuff would have used tobacco twine to roll theirs, and it'd have been something similar to this thread here with the same concept as the tobacco twine. Would have had that about the same thickness, and you could have noticed it. But today it's a little harder to find tobacco twine since this region has gone away from cropping tobacco and growing tobacco. But it still can be found at farm stores and stuff. But I personally like to use sinew. I have about most of the colors. I don't have all of them here today, but I have most of the colors of sinew that I use, and I like to use it. One of my favorites is probably the traditional color, or natural color sinew, and I like to use it. But for today's purpose for instructions, I'm gonna use red because it sticks out on the pine needle a little better. So basically I just get about 1.5 yards of sinew off. Some people like to split their sinew and while they're working with it, but I like to go ahead and use the whole strand. And basically I'm just getting a big eye needle, and I use it to put the sinew in. All right, we have our sinew in the needle. And while making baskets and everything, if you're going to start from scratch, this is what we're about to do is probably one of the hardest things to do in the whole basket making is getting started. The first wrap or two is always the hardest of getting started, right in the center. A lot of people tried this, and before they even complete the first row or two, they already give up and they quit because it's not, they already get frustrated and go ahead and throw it down. After I get this started, then I'll show you another technique that is more simpler. And really, I like to teach that way first sometimes because it gets their interest. And basically all I done is took the needles out and I dried them off, just tapped them with the paper towel, dried them off. And if you look, when you got the pine needles off of the pine cone, you usually got 3 to 4 strands in the in here. But when you take that piece off, the top piece off here, it breaks them down where the individual. And usually when I start, according when they're real thick pine needles and pretty long ones, I'll start with about 8 to 10 needles. And this is, you have to pay attention here. I tapped them together, got them all even. All right. I got my 8 to 10 needles. I got the opposite end of the needle of where the needle's on my sinew. I take the opposite end and I basically just lay it opposite of the pine needles, about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. That's all I have, about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. Got all of my needles together, got the pine needle. All right, you'll see the tip of it, of the string. Tip them. Now just start wrapping. You get that? I'll do it again. Watch. I just wrap and see how much I just barely have the tip of the pine needle left over. And I just keep wrapping. That's where this whole strand of the sinew comes in very well, as it covers up and it goes thick across there when you're wrapping.
Mr. Locklear, we have a question in the chat about would crochet cotton or packing string work in place of the sinew?
If you go, I like to use this here. Hold on, I want to answer that question just 1 second. Let me get this where I can stop and then I'll answer it. I go about 1 inch there down the sinew or down the pine needles, And basically all I'm doing, I take my needle and I stick it through the where I wrapped it. And to me, my fingers aren't what they used to be, so I like to get a pair of needle nose pliers and just pull it through. And now, if I need to sit this down and go do something, I can run around the house or go, and then when I come back, it's right here. But the only thing about it, remember, it's wet and you need to bend it, so don't take too long with that. But get back to the question with the crochet thread and stuff. I like to use you can go to Walmart, and I don't know if this is crochet thread. I don't know what it's called, honestly, but it's just a $2 bundle thread at Walmart. I like to use it where I can double it up, and I got a there's a certain size. I think it's number 3. I'm thinking it's number 3 on the spool that I use because of the thickness of it. Because because I double it, I don't want it real thick. I use this here where to mimic the tobacco twine a lot. I have used raffia to make it. The only thing about raffia, you pull tight and it breaks. You have to be careful with pulling raffia. That's why I like to use the sinews, because I like to pull it real tight, and my baskets are real tight and they're not going nowhere. That's why I use the sinew a lot. The twine, I'll make it. If somebody requests using twine or thread or certain colors, I'll use thread instead of sinew. But this here you can also pull pretty good. So pretty much if you can put it in a needle, I think you could use it. The same concept of wrapping as you do with the sinew. All right, getting back to this. All right, we're at a point now. We wrapped it up. I got my first, I got my needle through it and pulled it where it just stay there. Now we're going to take, and basically all we're doing is bending it in half. If you can see, all I've done is just pretty much bent the part that I have wrapped and put it in half. And I'm going to carry my needle right back through it again to hold it where I hold that. And basically you see all this, carry the needle through both pieces and pulled it through. And here's the tricky part. You got that first bend there. Now the first row of your needle. If you can see right here, that's that extra piece of that string that I had left over. Basically, all you just take the scissors and cut it off. All right. This first row here, if you can see on the camera, you'll see what I wrapped. And then you have the first row of straw that you can actually see and everything. Basically, all I'm doing is wrapping the string around it. And I go back into where I wrapped around and pull through. And there's your first stitch right there. And now basically all you're doing is going every, I like to say 1/8 an inch and do a stitch, but you're doing the same concept. Go back around and pull it through. And you want to separate the where you can see the pine needles in the stitches. If you'll see right here, you'll start seeing the pine needles come out in the stitch in the basket. About every 1/8 of an inch. And you'll see it just wrap around. Some people ask, when do you like to add pine needles? Because you're going to eventually run out. I've taught classes where the kids get carried away of stitching and they forget to add pine needles. And they get all the way to the end and say, I messed up. You ain't messed up. You just have to start adding pine needles more than you like. But usually I'll go around about the first round, and then I'll add pine needles to it. I'll start adding. I get my first row sewn in, and all I'm doing is sticking it and pulling it. I'm gonna try to do this backwards where you can see better the concept of what I'm doing. I'm just wrapping, make sure the string goes around the pine needle. You'll see I'm just sticking it in and pulling it through. But right before I pull it tight, I try to lay it down where I want it at. When I pull it tight, it's there. You ain't got to worry about going nowhere. I'll tell you a story about actually making pine needles and everything, because my grandparents used to make the pine needle baskets all the time. They said, I've talked to them about it, because when I first learned how to do this, I went home to a family reunion and I carried the pine needle baskets there and everything. I was all proud and everything. I didn't know anybody that made them in my family. And I carried it and they almost laughed at me, because as my grandparents and my grandmother and her siblings were growing up, there was probably I think there was 12 of them. They made baskets all the time. And a lot of times they made, especially like Easter time, they made their baskets for Easter. And they'd use the green pine needles. And when they got done with the Easter baskets and stuff, they just threw them away. It was nothing common for them not to make a basket when they needed it. They needed to store something, they'd use it. They got done with that project, they'd throw it away. So when they needed another one, they'd just make it. And I ain't gonna say my feelings was hurt when they told me that the story of them throwing all the baskets away and them. They already knew how to make them and stuff, but I was disappointed a little bit. And but they took the joy of me thinking I was the only one that knew how to do it, I reckon, away from me. But like I said, they'd make it with the green pine needles, and I've saw people use the green pine needles to make baskets. And the only thing about using green pine needles, you can use them and they will bend. You don't have to wet them or nothing like that. But the thing about them is they dry. When they dry, they're going to shrink. They might shrink just a hair, but that hair is going to make it loose. And eventually, if you handle it enough, it's going to fall apart. I took green pine needles and you take and collect pine needles off the tree like that green. And if you store them inside the house, they're going to be lighter than if you store them outside, or if you find them outside and pick them off the ground. Their color don't fade as easy, and they don't get as dark. Because I can look at baskets that I've made, and I can say, hey, that one, I know that one I collected and dried it in the house, and that one there I probably found outside, and the needles outside, because they're darker color. And I did dry some green one time, and I kept it out of the light, and it kept that green tint to it. And when I made a basket and everything, I done it for art contest. They had the green tint, and my best friend ended up buying it, but when he stored it in his house, just the lights from his house caused the pine needles to turn color. They were even lighter brown, but it still had a green faded tint to them. But the green tint come out of them, most of it. You can take and dye pine needles. A lot of times you can go on the internet and you can find pine needles that are dyed. Like these here was they were using for a project, and they had dyed them purple, and they were getting them out to the kids at the NAO conference one year, and I had to have them because I've never had dyed pine needles. I'm still waiting for it to hit me to make a project with those, because I don't know how that dye is going to come off on your hands and everything. But you can dye pine needles just like you can dye clothes and use them as well. All right, getting back to the basket. If I want to add, you can take one pine needle. I like to use one pine needle, especially when I'm first starting. I don't like to add a lot of pine needles at the beginning till I get a couple rows, and then I'll add one or two pine needles. But most of the time I add one pine needle, and I stick it right in the middle of the group of pine needles. So you will never see from the beginning of that basket all the way to the end, you'll never see the tip of the pine needles. You'll see one continuous pine needle, looks like. When you hide it in the center like that, it'll stay there in the center. And once you trying to get used to this mask on. A lot of times I'll take and get my stitch ready. I don't know if y'all saw that pine needle fall out or not, but I get my stitch ready. Then I stick the pine needle in the center. When I stick it in the center, and then I stitch it down, it's there. You don't have to worry about it falling out after that. You get that stitch on there. All right, I got one more stitch, and I'll be made around one whole time. Then we get to start. I say the sighting part of it, because you'll get to start your pattern on how you want to do your basket to come out. If y'all have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm not one to talk a lot, so if y'all need ask questions.
We do have one question.
All right.
When did you first begin making pine needle baskets?
I'm still kind of new with making this. I've probably been making baskets about, I'm gonna say anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And I got a funny story on that too. I was an ISS instructor in school, sitting there, and I was bored. It was boring in there. All you do is make kids be quiet and sit there and hope you have a jacket. And back in my day, well, I used to make dream catchers in ISS, and I would sell them to the kids for a couple of dollars when around and make them for everything. And I got bored with that, and I said I wanted to learn how to make the baskets. Here in North Carolina, like I said before, our grandparents used to make baskets a long time ago, and it kind of died away as technology come around and everything. A lot of people quit making baskets. And then I had my Sunday school teacher, when she retired from teaching, she started Miss Loretta Oxendine. She started making baskets, pine needle baskets, and brought it back to the limelight. And I saw her baskets, and I said one day I think I can do that. And I looked at one of her baskets and I sit there and studied it until I got the concept down of how to make baskets. And then, lo and behold, I looked on the internet. Wow, there was instructions on the internet how to make baskets. And then, but I sit there and taught myself how to do it really, and then I found instructions on how to do it.
And how long does it take to make a basket?
Used to, I could sit there and if I'm sitting still when nobody messing with me, I can knock out a 2 or 3 inch basket around and high in about an hour and a half. Now that I've got older and got my kids that got older and everything, I don't have that peace and quiet no more. So it might take me a day or two. Like this concept here, like I said, I like to think outside the box a lot. I come up with this idea. I mean, this is coming from scratch and everything of how to make a moccasin. And it took me a while to do it, but it took me, I went to when I was in ISS teaching, I got there that morning, and by the time the bell let out to go to school, I had completed the concept of it from scratch. The only thing I had done was cut out the bottom of the moccasin, the bottom of it before. But I come up with the idea and come up with scratch and done it. And a lot of my projects like the crown and stuff, I had to sit there and think, and I'd do something and go back. But within a week, it took me a week to come up with the concept of how to make it. Then once I come up with the concept, I could knock out one in 2 days from start to finish. A lot of times when I make the disc, I mean, I knock out a disc in an hour sitting down, and I do it. We've used disc. I had people use them for Christmas tree ornaments. I remember a long time ago in church where we had the baskets, just a simple baskets where they collected money every Sunday. They passed the basket around, the pine needle basket. I remember seeing that before. But that's like this basket here. I probably worked on it while I'm at the museum weekend, and talking to the crowd that come through. It took me probably about 5 years to do this on that 2-day weekend. But I mean, that's talking to the crowd and stuff. So I mean, it's simple. I mean, if you got the peace and quiet, I say you can knock it out. I can't watch TV and do baskets. To me, my thought ain't in it. I have to go somewhere quiet, and if I'm somewhere quiet, I can knock it out in no time. An hour or two, I can knock out a basket. But one thing before we get started, I know we're getting close to the end. To me personally, my stitches, I like to go back into the previous stitch. Once you go all the way around, completely around, you don't have to go all the way to the center. And you're not going to the center when you're doing that first row, and you're going through the wrap part. So when I get that first row in, I go back through the same stitch and pull it through. I do want to tell you that before we leave. Pull it through, and that's where you'll start seeing your pattern come through, is that same stitch. You get that concept of doing the same stitch over and over, which on the previous basket where I showed you, you'll have something similar to this. When you're going to do that same stitch, you'll start seeing a pattern. But my favorite, I don't know if you can tell it, is a wheat stitch. That's where you go through every stitch. When you come back around, you go through every stitch twice. So, and then you spread it out and make a wheat. So when you come back around, you stick in that same one and then start twirling. Yeah. So I think about 5 minutes left. If anybody else has any questions, right quick.
What is the most difficult part about working with pine needles?
To me, like I said, like if I'm doing a basket from the beginning, from the very beginning here, the start off is the worst part. I said earlier, I'd show you another way. Like this is something new that I I bought some walnut shells that were sliced, and I just used those. And then you don't have to have the start net center. You had the walnut shell. It's got holes, natural holes in it. So all you're doing is just my pine needles. I'll just show you the concept of it right quick. You're just taking basically, you're laying the pine needles on top of the shell, and then you're just stitching it around, stitching the sinew around it. So you don't have that that difficult part of getting started. But once if you get this far, this started right here, that's the hardest part of the whole pine needle basket to me, is getting started. I've taught on numerous classes, and if I can get them past the getting started at first row, if I get them to that second, third row, it's over with. They got it. Because the rest of it, if you ever sewn before, the same concept. All you're doing is sewing, adding pine needles and sewing. So it isn't difficult once you get past the center and everything. And I have another story about the center of the pine needle and everything. And if you look, when you make that wrap around it, sometimes you're going to have a hole left in the center. And you got that wrap, that center is completely covered. That's your circle. That's your circle of life. That's your family, your community. That's everything right there in the center of that pine needle. As being Native American and everything, that's what's really close to all of us, and special to us, is that our circle, who we associate with, who our family is. So that's going to be our circle of life right there.
Yeah, that kind of ties in with another question from the chat is, how do you come up with designs for baskets, and do they have meaning behind them?
Basically, I can have a concept of, when I start a basket, I'll have, now if somebody special orders something, yeah, I'll try to sit down and do that order. But if I'm doing a basket and it's me doing it the way I want to do it, I have concept of what I want. When I sit down, that basket's going to go the way it wants to. Very seldom when I make one, it's going to turn out the way I wanted it to. It's like the basket has a life of its own. And if you ever work with pottery and everything, it's the same concept. If you're doing pottery, it's the same thing. A lot of times that basket or that pottery is going to come out the way it wants to. If you're trying to force it to go, it won't never go. You'll never get that basket right. It'll fall apart. It'll do. So to me, it's the same concept. It's going to have it has a life of its own.
Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
And that, just like doing this with pine needles, this same concept don't have to be with just pine needles. Anything. I seen a quote one time: if it'll bend, you can bend it. If it won't bend, make it bend. And that's the same concept with to me with baskets. Is you can take anything and make a basket out of it. You take weeds, pine needles, because you make it work for what you want, what you need it for.
This was so great. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you all for joining us. There are many other events to join and watch. Just go to the schedule at nc-aihc.com. Thanks so much.